Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The thought came uninvited, absurd even because it wasn't a briefing table anymore. It was a plastic chair in a government building that smelled of disinfectant and faint despair. But the way they all talked over her, it brought her back. Back to the long corridors of command posts where she'd once stood invisible in uniform, waiting for a superior to notice her report. Only now she wasn't in uniform. Just a faded jacket 3 sizes too big, sleeves swallowed her hands, and boots held together with duct tape. Margaret Sullivan had been sitting in that VA hospital waiting room for 4 hours. 4 hours of polite smiles that never reached the eyes. 4 hours of just wait, ma'am, we'll call your name soon. 4 hours of watching others, younger, louder, shinier, pass by as if she didn't exist. She didn't mind the waiting. Soldiers learned patience better than anyone. What hurt was the forgetting. The receptionist barely looked up when she'd handed in her paperwork that morning. A quick scan, a sigh, a perfunctory stamp. Have a seat, ma'am, we'll call you. Then nothing. No eye contact. No acknowledgement that this woman, hunched, gray-haired, smelling faintly of damp wool, had once pulled wounded men from burning wreckage. To them she was just another case file. A number, another broken piece of the endless machine. Across from her, a young Marine scrolled through his phone, crisp in his dress blues. His ribbons glinted in the fluorescent light, each one a story he probably hadn't yet learned the weight of. He looked up once, just long enough for his eyes to skim her face, wrinkle his nose slightly, then look away. She almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because she understood him too well. She'd been him once, proud, sharp-edged, blind to the ghosts around her. To her left, 2 officers in fatigues were talking about promotions and overseas assignments, laughter echoing too loud for such a somber place. She caught pieces, colonels pushing for the slot. If my eval comes through next month, words she'd heard 1,000 times before, back when she still believed the system rewarded service and not politics. Her gaze dropped to the scuffed linoleum. A crack ran between her boots like a small canyon. She traced it with her eyes, letting her mind drift. Waiting rooms had a way of blurring time, softening hours into something shapeless. A nurse passed by without looking. A security guard adjusted his belt, checked his watch. The TV in the corner flickered through local news. Somewhere behind the counter, a printer jammed, and a voice cursed under their breath. Life went on around her, without her. She wasn't bitter, not really. Life had taught her the difference between bitterness and acceptance. One corrodes you. The other just dulls the edges until you can survive the next day. But today, something in her chest felt heavy. Not sadness exactly, something deeper. Like all the air around her was thick with memories waiting to be remembered. She closed her eyes for a second. And she was back there. Fallujah 2006. Sand in her teeth. Smoke in her throat, the sound of chaos all around screaming, the metallic stench of blood, and that high ringing in her ears that came after every explosion. "Medic, we're hit," someone had yelled. She ran before she could think, before the fear could reach her legs. The Humvee was burning, black smoke curling into the sky. And then she saw him, barely 20, face pale under the soot, leg twisted wrong. Second Lieutenant Robert Hale. His first deployment. "Don't you move, Lieutenant," she'd barked, voice steady, even though her leg was bleeding too. I can't feel." "Good, that means it's still attached." She smiled then, absurdly calm. "Now shut up and breathe." She remembered the weight of him on her shoulders, the smell of burning fuel, the stutter of gunfire somewhere beyond the wreck. She remembered dragging him 300 yards through hell until the medevac came. She remembered not being scared until it was over. And then she remembered nothing. The memory faded as a cold draft swept through the waiting room. She opened her eyes again. The world was fluorescent and gray and small. Her number on the screen still hadn't changed. A boy, maybe 19, was helping his grandfather fill out forms 2 seats over. The old man's hands shook so badly he couldn't hold the pen straight. Margaret looked at them, and for a moment her heart ached in quiet solidarity. The boy caught her looking, gave a quick polite smile, and turned back to his task. It was fine, they didn't know her. No one did anymore. 6 months on the street had stripped her of identity. The mirror at the shelter showed her a stranger every morning, hollow cheeks, tired eyes, the posture of someone who'd learned not to take up space. She'd lost count of the nights she'd fallen asleep with her back to a wall, her old service jacket pulled over her knees, the city humming indifferently around her. Still, she came here every week, filed the same forms, asked the same questions, waited, because something in her refused to stop trying, a stubborn spark that wouldn't die even when everything else did. Her husband had passed 5 years after her retirement, heart attack, quick, merciful, her daughter gone 2 years later, cancer, and with each loss her world had folded smaller, pension eaten by hospital bills, benefits delayed by clerical errors, friends scattered, buried, or too far away to find. The army had taught her discipline, courage, survival, but not how to be alone. She rubbed her hands together, bones aching from the cold air conditioning. The sound of boots echoed suddenly through the hallway, heavy, confident, not the shuffle of ordinary staff. A ripple of attention moved through the room. The doors opened. Every head turned. The man who entered wore the kind of presence that filled space before his words did. 4 stars on his shoulders, ribbons that told a lifetime of war. General Robert Hale. He moved like someone who'd carried command long enough to hate it and love it in equal measure. His aide trailed behind him, clipboard ready, eyes scanning. They spoke briefly to the receptionist, something about an inspection. The receptionist stammered, flustered, glancing around the messy waiting room like suddenly seeing it for the first time. Margaret barely looked up. She'd seen plenty of generals. They all blurred together after a while, sharp edges, perfect uniforms, the same clipped tone. But then he stopped. Right there in front of her. The air seemed to thin. For a second nobody breathed. The aide nearly bumped into him. General Hale's eyes locked on her face, confusion, then disbelief, then something else. His posture straightened even more, though that seemed impossible, and then his hand moved. Slowly, deliberately. A salute. A perfect, razor-sharp salute, the kind that made air go still, the kind that didn't need explanation. The room froze. The young Marine's phone slipped from his fingers. The officers near the coffee machine went silent mid-laugh. The receptionist's mouth hung open. Margaret blinked, unsure if she was dreaming. "Sergeant Major Sullivan," the general said quietly. His voice cracked not from age but from something heavier. "Ma'am." Her mind stuttered. Did he just? She stared at him, trying to bridge the gap between now and then. Between the old woman in a frayed jacket and the soldier she used to be. "Robert," she whispered finally, disbelief softening her voice. "Little Bobby Hale." The name rolled out before she could stop it. The general swallowed hard, salute still held, eyes glistening. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It's been a long time." And then in that sterile, indifferent waiting room something shifted. The weight of years, the invisible walls around her life, the noise, the indifference, the forgetting, it all fell away. Because in that moment, every person there finally saw her. Not the jacket, not the age. But her. The woman who once crawled through fire for others. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the ache and the fatigue, Margaret felt it again. The quiet pulse of pride she'd buried long ago. The kind that never really dies. Not in soldiers. Not in heroes nobody remembers. "General, please," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to." But he didn't move. His salute stayed firm. His hand trembled, but his posture didn't. And in that frozen moment, the waiting room, that place of apathy and low murmurs, turned into something sacred. Someone whispered, "Who is she?" Another muttered, "Why's he saluting her?" The young Marine, the one with the polished ribbons, straightened instinctively, his face pale. The general finally lowered his hand. The motion was slow, reverent. His voice, when it came, was quiet, almost too soft for his rank. "You probably don't remember me," he said. "Fallujah, 6. IED took out our convoy. I was just a second lieutenant. You were our medic." A sound escaped Margaret, not quite a gasp, not quite a sob. Her hand went to her mouth. "Lieutenant Hale," she breathed, then shaking her head slightly, correcting herself. "Robert." He nodded once. "You carried me 300 yards under fire, dragged me out of that Humvee after it went up. You saved 3 of us that day." The murmurs grew. The young Marine's phone hung forgotten in his lap. The 2 officers near the coffee machine had gone rigid, unsure whether to step closer or look away. The receptionist fumbled with her computer mouse like it could somehow erase what was unfolding. The general continued. "You took a bullet that day, too, in your leg. Refused evacuation until every wounded man was safe." Margaret's eyes glistened. "That was a long time ago," she said softly. "Not to me." Something in his tone made the room ache. He turned to his aide, a nervous captain with wide eyes, and gestured sharply. "Find the hospital director. Now." The aide blinked. "Sir, yes, sir." And then he was gone, boots echoing down the hallway. General Hale turned back to Margaret. "Why are you here like this?" he asked. His voice wasn't the voice of command anymore. It was the voice of a man trying not to break. "What happened?" Margaret looked down at her hands. The knuckles were thin, the skin marked by years of weather and hard living. Her thumb rubbed the edge of her jacket sleeve, an old habit from her days cleaning weapons after a mission. "It's a long story," she said. "I have time." The truth was, she hadn't told it to anyone. Not really. The story had grown heavier with silence. Words rusted in her throat every time she'd tried. "I retired in 2008, she began quietly. 24 years, 3 deployments, figured I'd finally have some peace." She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that breaks halfway through. "My husband Tom got sick not long after. Heart trouble. Medical bills kept coming. The pension helped for a while, but it's never enough, you know how it goes." The general nodded. He did know. He'd seen it before, the slow, grinding collapse that claimed soldiers long after the battles were done. "When he passed," she continued, "I moved in with my daughter, Emily. She was my world." Her voice cracked on the name. "Then cancer, quick, brutal, 2 years of hospitals and hope. I sold the house to keep her treatments going. After she was gone, there wasn't much left." She paused. The silence hurt. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt disrespectful. "The benefits I was supposed to get," she said, staring at the floor. "They got lost in red tape, wrong forms, wrong signatures. Every time I came here, they said they'd call. They never did. 6 months ago, I ran out of savings. I started sleeping at the shelter. I come here every week hoping someone will finally fix it." Her eyes lifted to his. "Guess I got used to being invisible." The general's jaw clenched. Tears filled his eyes, not the theatrical kind, but the quiet, angry kind that soldiers hide behind discipline. "You're not invisible," he said, each word deliberate. "Not anymore." By now, the hospital director had arrived, red-faced, breathless, trying to read the situation. "General Hale, sir, what's going on? I wasn't informed of your visit." "Sit down," Hale said sharply, without looking at him. The tone that had commanded battlefields returned for a heartbeat, and it silenced the entire room. "You've got a veteran sitting here for 4 hours, ignored, homeless, forgotten. You're going to fix that right now." The director sputtered something about protocols, forms, authorizations. All the words Margaret had heard too many times. Hale didn't move. "You see this woman," he said, pointing gently toward her. "This is Sergeant Major Margaret Sullivan, Silver Star, combat medic, Iraq and Afghanistan. She's the reason I'm standing here breathing." Gasps rippled through the staff nearby. The young Marine looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. The director's face drained of color. I didn't know, sir." "You should have," the general said. "That's the damn problem." He crouched down beside her chair, a four-star general kneeling in front of a homeless woman who once carried him through fire. He took her hand. The gesture was small, human, devastating. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you saved my life. Let me return the favor." Her lips trembled. "You don't have to. I already did nothing for too long." He turned to his aide who just returned. "Get her paperwork, process it now. Call the regional office. If anyone gives you trouble, tell them Robert Hale's office is asking why." "Yes, sir." The aide was gone again, sprinting. The general sat beside her now. For a long time, neither spoke. The chaos of the waiting room hummed faintly in the background, phones ringing, murmurs, footsteps, but none of it mattered. "You know," he said quietly, "I've given hundreds of speeches about leadership, about courage, but that day in Fallujah, you taught me more than any academy ever did." Margaret smiled faintly. "I was just doing my job." He shook his head. "No, you were doing what was right, even when nobody was watching." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the heaviness in his shoulders. The boy she'd carried through fire had grown into a man burdened by too many ghosts of his own. "You turned out all right," she said softly. "I had good teachers." A nurse approached timidly with a cup of coffee. Her hand shook slightly as she handed it to Margaret. "Here you go, ma'am," she said, voice small but sincere. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. The nurse nodded, eyes glossy. She wasn't just being polite, she was seeing her now, not as a case but as a person. Around them the atmosphere shifted. Shame, awe, quiet respect, it all hung in the air like a collective reckoning. The young Marine finally stood, walked over, and snapped a salute so crisp it made the room echo. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" he asked, voice trembling. She blinked. "Go ahead, son." "I'm sorry," he said. "For earlier I didn't know." Margaret gave a small, sad smile. "You don't have to be sorry for not knowing. Just remember next time, don't look away." "Yes, ma'am." He lowered his salute, eyes red. The hospital director excused himself quietly to make frantic calls. Papers shuffled. Keys clacked. The machine that had ignored her for months finally roared to life. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt seen. Not pitied, not processed, seen. But even amid that sudden kindness, her heart trembled with unease. Because she knew how systems worked. They moved fast when someone important watched, then slowed down again when the spotlight faded. She didn't want charity, she wanted change. She glanced at the general. "You can't fix the whole thing, Robert." He looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe not, but I can damn well start." Her throat tightened. It wasn't the words, it was the way he said them. The conviction, the humility. They sat there in silence again. Two soldiers separated by time, but bound by something older. Something that didn't need uniforms or ranks. Outside, through the glass doors, the afternoon light began to fade. The city kept moving, cars, sirens, footsteps, unaware that inside this dull waiting room, something sacred had just been remembered. And as Margaret sipped her coffee, warmth spreading through hands that had known too much cold, she thought maybe, just maybe, not all was lost. Because sometimes, dignity doesn't need to raise its voice. It just needs someone to notice. It started with a single photo. No headline, no caption, just an image someone snapped on a cell phone, a four-star general saluting an elderly woman in a worn jacket. The light hit their faces just right, reverence meeting disbelief. And by the time the photo hit social media that night, it was already too late to contain it. Within hours, the picture had gone viral. People wanted to know, who was she? Why was he saluting her? By morning, the VA hospital's phone lines were jammed. Reporters camped outside. Words like hero, neglect, injustice, and honor flooded the headlines. Politicians issued statements. Hashtags trended. Strangers demanded answers. But Margaret Sullivan didn't see any of that right away. She was asleep, for the first time in a real bed in months. The blanket was thin, the mattress lumpy, but the quiet was priceless. The constant shuffle of the shelter was gone. No coughing, no footsteps, no whispered arguments in the dark. Just silence, broken only by the slow hum of the heater. When she opened her eyes, sunlight poured through the blinds. For a second, she forgot where she was. Then she saw the folded uniform on the chair beside her, clean, pressed, smelling faintly of soap instead of smoke, and remembered. Yesterday, her life had changed. The general had made sure of it, benefits processed, back pay approved, apartment arranged, food stocked, a social worker assigned. It had all happened so fast that it barely felt real. She sat up slowly, hands trembling slightly as they brushed the edge of the blanket. Her knees ached, but that was an old pain, familiar, almost comforting. What wasn't familiar was the way her chest felt light for once. She glanced around the small apartment, one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a table with mismatched chairs. Someone had placed a vase with a single white carnation on the counter. It looked too delicate for the life she'd lived. She stood, moving to the window. Outside, the city moved as it always had, indifferent, restless, alive. But she wasn't part of its shadows anymore. Not today. Her phone, a cheap one the VA had provided, buzzed with messages she didn't understand. Unknown numbers, news outlets. We'd love to interview you. Your story is inspiring. America needs to hear your voice. She turned it face down on the table. The noise could wait. She spent a lifetime serving quietly. She wasn't sure she wanted fame now. Then a knock on the door. She froze for a heartbeat, old instincts, then exhaled and opened it. General Hale stood there, not in full uniform this time, just a pressed shirt, sleeves rolled up, the ribbons replaced by quiet humanity. Behind him, the aide carried a folder and 2 cups of coffee. "Morning, Sergeant Major," Hale said with a small smile. "Permission to come in." Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside. "You brought coffee, that earns you entry." He chuckled softly. Old habits, always better to debrief with caffeine. They sat at the table. He looked around the apartment, nodding approvingly. "You okay here?" "It's more than I ever expected," she said. "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" He met her eyes. "Don't disappear again." The words hit harder than he knew. She looked down at her hands. "I didn't mean to. Life just kept getting smaller. I didn't know how to ask for help." "That's not on you," he said firmly. "That's on us, on the system, on the people who forgot what service really means." She smiled faintly. "Careful, General. You start talking like that, they'll take away your parking spot." He laughed quietly, then his tone softened. "You should know your story out there now, the photo, the salute. People are talking." Margaret frowned. "Talking?" He nodded. "In a good way. The VA, the Pentagon, even Congress. They're asking questions. They want to meet you." "Meet me for what?" "To listen," he said simply. "Or at least to pretend to. Either way, you've started something, Margaret. You reminded them what this uniform stands for." She looked out the window again. "I didn't mean to start anything." "Sometimes the best revolutions begin by accident," he said. "All you did was exist and refuse to vanish quietly. That's enough." The aide set down a folder. "Ma'am, this has all your documents, a pension restored, benefits reinstated, medical coverage. And the general wanted me to give you this personally." He handed her a small velvet box. Margaret hesitated before opening it. Inside was a silver star, her own. She hadn't seen it in years. It had been lost when she'd sold her home, left behind in a box she couldn't carry. Her breath caught. How? We tracked it down, Hale said. Found it in an old storage auction listing. Someone online recognized your name. She touched the metal like it might dissolve. The metal was cool. The ribbon faded, but it still carried the weight of memory. The screams, the smoke, the blood, the silence after the chaos. I don't know if I deserve it anymore, she murmured. Hale's voice was quiet but firm. You never stopped deserving it. The metal doesn't make you who you are. You make it mean something. She swallowed hard, blinking away tears. You really became a good man, Bobby. He smiled softly. You made sure of it. For a long time they sat in silence. Two soldiers, two lives shaped by the same moment in fire and dust. No words needed. Outside, sirens wailed distantly. Inside, the heater hummed. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt like she could breathe without flinching. By evening, the world had caught up with her. The VA director called, apologizing profusely. A local news crew asked for permission to feature her in a human interest segment. She refused. Not because she was bitter, but because she wasn't a spectacle. She told them, there are 1,000 others like me. Tell their stories. The reporter hesitated. But your story doesn't end with me, she interrupted gently. It ends when no one else gets forgotten. That line made it into the story anyway. It played on every local channel that night. And when the clip reached Washington, things began to move. Committees called emergency sessions. Veterans, organizations demanded reforms. The photo, the salute, appeared on magazine covers with headlines like The Forgotten Hero, and when honor finally looked back. Through it all, Margaret stayed quiet. She spent her days walking to the park near her apartment, feeding the pigeons, watching the kids play. People sometimes recognized her, but she never quite got used to it. They'd stop, thank her, ask for a photo. She'd smile, nod, and go back to the bench once they left. It wasn't about being seen anymore. It was about being real again. One afternoon, as autumn leaves drifted through the park, she saw the young Marine from the waiting room jogging past. He stopped, startled, then approached. Ma'am, he snapped a salute instinctively. Didn't expect to see you here. At ease, Marine, she said, smiling. You off duty? Yes, ma'am, stationed nearby. I wanted to say thank you again for that day. You changed how I look at things. She tilted her head. How so? He hesitated, searching for the right words. I used to think service was about being strong, about medals, ranks, but now I think it's about seeing people, the ones nobody sees. She smiled, proud and sad all at once. Then you're learning faster than most. He grinned, saluted again, and jogged off. Margaret watched him disappear into the trees. Then she whispered to herself, maybe the future's in better hands after all. Weeks passed. The photo was still circulating, but the noise had faded. The world had found new things to care about, new stories to share. But one evening, a black car pulled up outside her apartment complex. General Hale stepped out, dressed in full uniform this time. She met him at the door, puzzled. What's this? She asked. He smiled. Just a small ceremony, nothing flashy. We're honoring a few veterans tonight. You're one of them. She sighed. Robert. Don't argue, just come. He offered his arm and she took it. The hall they entered wasn't large, a modest VA auditorium filled with soldiers, nurses, and families. On the stage stood a simple podium, a flag, and a row of folding chairs. When she stepped inside, the room rose in applause. She froze. Dozens of uniforms, civilians, young, old, some standing with canes, others with prosthetics, all clapping for her. The general guided her forward, his voice carrying across the room. Sometimes heroes don't come home to parades, he said. Sometimes they come home to paperwork, silence, and forgotten promises. Tonight, we correct that. He turned to her. Sergeant Major Margaret Sullivan, for exceptional courage under fire for decades of service, and for reminding us all what honor truly means. Welcome home. The applause thundered again. Margaret stood there trembling slightly. The lights blurred through her tears. Then slowly she raised her hand not in salute but in gratitude. When the ceremony ended, reporters waited again. She avoided them all. Instead, she found a quiet corner outside the building, where the cool night air carried the faint scent of rain. She looked up at the sky, the same one she'd stared at from the desert all those years ago, and whispered, "You can rest now, Tom. I'm home." Her reflection caught faintly in the glass door beside her. For the first time in decades, she recognized the woman looking back. Not broken, not forgotten, just seen. And as the stars shimmered above the city, Margaret Sullivan smiled. Because somewhere, far beyond the noise and the headlines, she knew the truth, the kind of truth soldiers carry quietly for the rest of their lives. Sometimes it's not the medals or the memories that define you. It's the moment someone finally remembers what you stood for. She never meant to start a movement. It began quietly, like most revolutions do, not with speeches or flags but with letters. The first arrived a week after the ceremony. No return address, just her name written in careful, uncertain handwriting. Inside was a note that said, "Sergeant Major Sullivan. I'm 74. Vietnam, 1969. I've been fighting the same VA system for years. Watching you stand there gave me hope again. Thank you." The second came the next day. Then the third. Within a week, her mailbox overflowed, handwritten notes, folded papers, even children's drawings. Some were from veterans, some from widows, some from people who'd never served but said they'd never look at an old soldier the same way again. One letter from a 12-year-old girl in Wisconsin said simply, "My grandpa never talks about the Army, but he cried when he saw your picture. I think you helped him remember who he is." Margaret kept that one on her refrigerator. She tried to read them all, but sometimes the weight of the words was too much. Every envelope carried someone else's loneliness, someone else's wound that hadn't healed. She realized that what had happened in that waiting room wasn't just her story, it was theirs. 1,000 versions of the same silence. And that was both beautiful and unbearable. The phone started ringing again. Reporters, veterans groups, politicians who wanted a quote or a handshake or a photo with the woman who woke the nation's conscience. She turned most of them down politely. But one invitation she couldn't ignore came from the Pentagon itself. The letter was formal, embossed with the seal she'd once worn proudly on her sleeve. "In recognition of your service and your contribution to veteran advocacy, we would be honored by your presence at the Department of Defense Service Recognition Summit." When she showed it to General Hale, he smiled. "They're not inviting you for show. They're inviting you because they're scared. You remind people of what they forgot to honor." She gave him a look. "And you're sure I should go?" "I think you have to go," he said. "Not for them, for everyone still sitting in a waiting room like you did." So she went. The Pentagon looked different than she remembered, newer, shinier, colder somehow. She walked through security with her shoulders squared, chin high, the way she used to walk into a field hospital at dawn, but her heart hammered like a young recruit. She wasn't intimidated by rank, not anymore. She was intimidated by the ghosts this place carried. The conference room was filled with brass, generals, admirals, senators, directors. Cameras lined the back wall. She hated cameras. They froze truth into something convenient. When they introduced her, the applause was polite, professional. She stood, every movement deliberate. No prepared notes, no script, just honesty. "Thank you," she began softly. "But you don't need to thank me, you need to listen." The room fell silent. "I've spent months in combat zones," she continued. "I've held dying soldiers in my arms. I've patched wounds under mortar fire. But do you know where I saw the most suffering? She paused. Right here, in the waiting rooms, in the silence, in the faces of people this country forgot once they stopped being useful. The air tightened. Some officials shifted uncomfortably. I don't blame you, she said. I blame what happens when we let paperwork replace people, when valor gets buried under policy, when those who serve come home and find out their war never really ended, it just changed shape. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried steady, unflinching. You all have the power to change that, but power means nothing without compassion. You can fix systems. You can sign reforms. But until you remember what dignity looks like, nothing changes. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then unexpectedly, applause began. Hesitant at first, then stronger. Even the officials who'd come out of obligation stood. General Hale, seated in the front row, felt his throat tighten. He'd seen courage on battlefields, but this quiet defiance was something else entirely. Afterward, several aides approached Margaret. They thanked her, promised action, asked for input. She nodded politely, knowing how easily promises fade once cameras stop rolling. But one man lingered, a young VA staffer, barely 30, nervous but earnest. Ma'am, he said, what you said, it hit home. My dad's a vet. He's been struggling to get his benefits. I've been so focused on the system I forgot the people. I won't anymore. She placed a hand on his shoulder. That's all I ask, just see them. That night she sat in her apartment, lights low, a soft hum of city noise outside. Her speech had gone viral again, clips replayed, words quoted, hashtags revived. And though everyone called her a hero, she didn't feel like one. Because behind every thank you was another story just like hers, and she couldn't save them all. She stared at the pile of letters on her table. One envelope, unopened, caught her eye. The handwriting was uneven, shaky. She tore it open. Dear Sergeant Major, my son served in Afghanistan. He took his own life last year waiting for an appeal from the VA. I saw you on TV, and for the first time, I didn't feel so angry. You reminded me that there are still people who care. Thank you for not giving up when so many do. Her chest constricted. She read it again, until the ink blurred through her tears. How many had she known? Soldiers who came home but never really returned. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent promise. I'll keep going for him, for all of them. Weeks later, she found herself invited to the Capitol. Hearings, proposals, the same dance of bureaucracy dressed in formality. But something had shifted. Her story had embarrassed too many powerful people to be ignored. General Hale accompanied her everywhere, not as a commander but as a friend. Sometimes he joked that he'd traded his stars for paperwork, helping veterans get their cases reopened. You started this, he told her once. I'm just trying to keep up. She shook her head. You're doing more than I ever could. Not true, he said. You gave them a reason to listen. That's leadership. She smiled faintly. Funny, I used to think leadership meant giving orders. It doesn't, he said. It means carrying people until they can walk again. You've been doing that all your life. One evening, they sat together at a cafe near the Lincoln Memorial. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Margaret watched the sunset reflect on the marble steps. I used to come here after my daughter's treatments, she said. I'd sit by the water, look at the reflection of the monument, and think she'd have liked this view. Hale looked at her gently. You still miss them. Every day, she said. But some days it feels like missing them keeps me human, reminds me that love survives the uniform. He nodded. We spend our lives learning how to fight, but nobody teaches us how to grieve. That's the hardest war of all, she murmured. They sat in silence, the city lights coming on one by one. In the distance they could hear faint laughter, a saxophone, the rhythm of life continuing. Do you ever think about Fallujah? She asked suddenly. Every day, he said. Do you remember what I told you back then, after I dragged you out? He smiled faintly. You said, "You're not dying today, Lieutenant, not on my watch." She chuckled softly. I was full of fire back then. You still are, he said quietly. It's just quieter now, but it's still there. She looked down, fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. I used to think the fire was for fighting. Maybe it's for remembering. Maybe it's both. The lights of the monument shimmered across the water. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, almost to herself, Margaret said, You know, I don't want to be famous. I just want people to see each other again. Hale smiled. Then you've already won. A month later, a documentary aired, Invisible No More, the Margaret Sullivan story. She hadn't wanted to participate, but when she learned the producers were interviewing struggling veterans across the country, she agreed on one condition, that her screen time be shared equally with theirs. The film opened with that same image, the general's salute, but it ended differently. Footage of shelters, hospitals, families, and quiet acts of kindness that rippled outward because one forgotten soldier refused to stay forgotten. Critics called it a reminder of conscience. Veterans called it finally real. Margaret didn't call it anything. She watched it once, cried softly, and then turned off the TV. Some stories didn't need to be relived twice. Later that night, she stood by her window again, watching the city lights blur through the glass. The letters were still coming, but now they were mixed with updates. People she'd helped, stories of veterans who'd found homes, doctors who'd changed how they treated patients. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't dared to in a long time. Hope. Not the kind shouted in speeches or printed in headlines. The kind that lived quietly. The kind you found in the eyes of a stranger who finally looked back. At midnight her phone buzzed, a text from General Hale. Tomorrow morning, the president's mentioning you in his address. I thought you should know. She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. Tell him to mention the others too. His reply came a minute later. He will because of you. She smiled, turned off the phone, and sat in the dark, letting the silence wrap around her like an old, familiar blanket. She wasn't invisible anymore. And yet she knew visibility wasn't the victory. Compassion was. That's what she'd learned after all the noise, all the headlines, all the applause. When the spotlight faded, what mattered most wasn't being seen. It was what people did with what they saw. And if just one young soldier looked at an old veteran differently tomorrow, then maybe, finally, the salute in that waiting room had meant something. They started calling her Sergeant Mom. It began as a joke. One young veteran at the shelter said it first, laughing after she'd scolded him for showing up late to an appointment. But the name stuck. Everyone began using it. Margaret didn't mind. In fact, she liked it. It gave her a reason to wake up early again. Every morning, she'd walk to the small community center near her apartment. The VA had converted an unused wing into a support hub for at-risk veterans, partly in response to her story. She helped convince them. Now, every day at 800 sharp, Margaret sat behind a folding table with a pot of burnt coffee, stacks of forms, and a handwritten sign that read, Need help, start here. At first, a few hesitant faces trickled in, mostly men her age, some younger, all carrying invisible scars. Then more came. Then too many to count. She didn't have credentials, just experience, and somehow that mattered most. She'd help them fill out forms, explain benefits, call offices that never answered, or just sit in silence when words weren't enough. Some days she made progress. Some days she didn't. But she was there, consistent, dependable, the one person who never left before the work was done. General Hale visited every Friday. Sometimes he brought donuts, sometimes just his company. The staff adored him, though they pretended not to fuss. Still giving orders, Sergeant Major, he'd tease. Only to people who listen, she'd shoot back, eyes twinkling. The bond between them had become something deeper than friendship. A quiet, unspoken alliance between two soldiers who had seen too much and yet refused to stop caring. One afternoon, as they sorted through a pile of outdated forms, she asked, "Do you ever get tired, Robert?" He looked up, surprised by the question. "Every day." "Then why keep doing it?" He smiled faintly. "Because of you. You reminded me what this uniform is supposed to mean." She paused. "It's supposed to mean service." He nodded. "Exactly, not status, not stars." She gave him a look. "You sure you're allowed to say that as a general?" He grinned. "Retirement, looking better every day." They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes from shared exhaustion and shared purpose. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Margaret stayed behind to lock up. The hall lights flickered as she gathered the leftover coffee cups. Her knees protested when she bent down, but she ignored the pain. She always did. She stopped by the bulletin board on her way out. It was covered with photos, faces of veterans they'd helped, families reunited, handwritten thank you notes. In the center hung that same photo from the waiting room, Hale's salute, frozen in time. Someone had written beneath it in marker, "Never again forgotten." She touched the edge of the photo gently. Her reflection wavered in the glass. And for a moment, she saw both women, the one from that day and the one she'd become since. Two versions of the same soldier. One waiting for help, the other giving it. She turned off the lights. The seasons turned quietly after that. Autumn brought gold leaves and early sunsets. Winter came harsh and heavy. Margaret kept working, though her body was starting to remind her of every year she'd carried through war and survival. She brushed it off, the fatigue, the shortness of breath, the dizziness. She survived worse, she told herself, and besides, there were too many people depending on her. But one morning, as she was writing a letter for a disabled veteran, her hand trembled so badly that the pen slipped. She blinked hard, trying to steady it. The tremor didn't stop. She didn't tell anyone. A few weeks later, she fainted in the hallway. When she came to, she was lying on a stretcher, the sharp smell of antiseptic filling her nose. The EMT leaned over her. "Easy, ma'am. You're gonna be okay." She muttered, half-conscious, "Not the first time I've heard that." At the hospital, they ran tests. The doctor was kind, too kind, the kind that made her nervous. "Your heart's weak," he said gently. "It's been through a lot. You'll need rest, medication, and no stress." She laughed bitterly. "No stress. You ever dealt with the VA?" He smiled. "Can't argue with that." When Hale arrived, she tried to wave it off. "I'm fine, Bobby, just dehydration." He wasn't amused. "You collapsed, Margaret." "I've done worse things standing up." He gave her that look, the one he used to give junior officers who tried to bluff their way out of responsibility. "You're not 20 anymore." She sighed, looking away. "Don't remind me." He sat beside her bed. "Promise me you'll slow down." "I can't," she said quietly. "There's too much left to do." "You've done more than enough." Her eyes softened. "You sound like my husband." "Smart man, apparently." She smiled faintly. He was. The silence between them lingered, comfortable, but tinged with fear neither wanted to name. Word spread quickly that she'd been hospitalized. Within days, cards and flowers filled her room. Veterans she'd helped came by to visit, each one telling stories, laughing too loud, promising she'd be back soon. One man, missing an arm but smiling wider than anyone, handed her a small pin. "You helped me get my benefits, ma'am. I've been sober 6 months. You did that." She held the pin like it was gold. "No," she said softly, "you did that." But when the visitors left and the lights dimmed, she felt the quiet press in. She wasn't afraid of dying. She'd made peace with that long ago. What scared her was leaving the work unfinished. Because this, helping others, fighting for them, had become her final mission. And soldiers don't abandon missions. She stared at the ceiling, the monitor beeping steadily beside her, and whispered, "Not yet." 2 weeks later, she was back at the center against medical advice, of course. The staff protested. The doctor called. Hale nearly ordered her to rest. She ignored them all. "I'm fine," she insisted. "I don't need much to sit and listen." And so she did. Every day. Her energy was lower now, her movements slower, but her eyes were still fierce, sharp as ever when someone tried to talk her out of helping. One morning, a young woman entered the office, early 20s, army cap, eyes hard and tired. She hesitated at the door. "You're Sergeant Sullivan, right?" "That's what they tell me," Margaret said with a smile. "Come in, sit." The woman sat, hands fidgeting. "I got out last year. I've been trying to get my medical claim approved. They keep saying it's pending. It's been 11 months. Margaret nodded. "You got copies of everything?" "Yeah. Let's see." They spent the next hour sorting through forms, making calls, hitting roadblocks. Every time the hold music started, the young soldier's frustration grew. "They don't care," she muttered finally. "I swear they just don't." Margaret's voice softened. "I used to think that too, but they're not all bad, just lost in the same machine." The young woman looked at her, eyes glassy. "I can't sleep, I can't work, I feel invisible." Margaret reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "You're not invisible, sweetheart. You're just waiting to be seen, and I promise you we'll make them see you." The woman's lip trembled. "You mean that?" "I don't say things I do mean." That small promise broke the dam. The young veteran cried quietly, ashamed at first, then freely. Margaret just sat there, holding her hand, no rush, no judgment. When the tears stopped, she passed her a tissue and said, "Now, let's try again." That day they got through. Someone on the other end finally listened. The claim was reopened. The girl left with tears of relief, and a smile Margaret hadn't seen at the beginning. When Hale stopped by that evening, he found Margaret asleep at the desk, pen still in hand. He covered her with his jacket and whispered, "You stubborn old miracle." The months blurred together after that. Her health continued to decline, but she never let it stop her completely. She refused interviews now. She didn't want to be remembered for speeches or ceremonies. She wanted to be remembered for showing up every day without fail. And that's exactly what she did. The people she helped began to call her their guardian angel. One even painted a mural on the community center wall, her silhouette beside a line of soldiers, sunlight breaking over them. The words underneath read, "She showed us we still matter." When she saw it, Margaret didn't cry. She just stood there, quiet, hand over her heart, whispering, "No, you showed me." One night, as snow began to fall outside her apartment, she sat at her table writing one last letter, to be opened after she was gone. "To whoever finds this, I wasn't special. I was just someone who refused to stop believing that we owe each other kindness. If my story taught you anything, let it be this: never walk past someone who looks forgotten. You might be walking past a hero. And if you wear the uniform or ever have, remember, we're family. We take care of our own. With love and gratitude, Sergeant Major Margaret Sullivan, Ret." She folded the letter, sealed it, and smiled. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the city in silence. She looked at the photo on her wall, that moment in the waiting room, frozen forever. Then, at the corner of the frame, she noticed something she hadn't before: the reflection of the flag behind her, faint but visible. She whispered, still standing. And then she closed her eyes, not in sorrow but in peace. That night, General Hale received a call. He didn't say a word, just nodded, eyes wet, and whispered, "Rest easy, Sergeant Major. Mission accomplished." The next morning, the flag at the community center flew at half-mast. Veterans came from across the state to pay their respects. Some she'd helped, some she'd inspired, some who had never met her but felt like they had. They placed letters, medals, and flowers at the mural. Someone hung a small sign that read, "You saw us when no one else did." And standing in the cold morning light, General Hale saluted once more, slow, steady, unbroken. Because that's what she'd taught him. That some salutes aren't given out of duty. They're given out of love. The news didn't break with fanfare. No breaking headline, no flashing banners, just a small paragraph on the local paper's third page. Sergeant Major Margaret Sullivan, Ret. 78, passed peacefully in her home yesterday evening. Decorated veteran, medic, and advocate for homeless service members. She is survived by those she helped, those she inspired, and a nation she reminded how to see its heroes again. That was all. And somehow it was enough. Because within hours, that tiny paragraph began to spread across phones, across forums, across hearts that remembered her face even if they'd never met her. By noon, the flag at the VA headquarters hung at half-mast. By evening, every major base in the country had followed. The photo, the same one that had started it all, resurfaced everywhere again. The general's salute, her worn jacket, the look in her eyes. People wrote messages under it like prayers. She made us remember. Rest easy, Sergeant Major. We see you now. But no one felt it more deeply than General Robert Hale. When the call came that night, he didn't speak for a long time. The officer on the other end waited in silence until he finally said, quietly, "Understood." Then he hung up and just sat there motionless, the clock ticking softly in the background. For a man who'd seen entire wars end, who'd written letters to families of soldiers who never came home, it still felt different this time. Because she had come home, just long enough to remind everyone what that word really meant. He went to her apartment at dawn. The police had already cleared the scene, left everything untouched. The air still carried her, faint coffee, old paper, and the quiet warmth of someone who'd lived gently but fiercely. On the table he found the letter, the one she'd written before the snow fell. He read it slowly, every line twice. When he reached the words, "You might be walking past a hero," his vision blurred. He folded the letter carefully, like it was something holy, and slipped it into his chest pocket. Then he stood in her living room for a long time, staring at the photo on her wall. The salute, the flag, the reflection she never noticed. "Still standing," he whispered. The funeral took place 3 days later at Arlington. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, but no one cared. The crowd stretched far beyond the small chapel, veterans, nurses, volunteers, strangers. Some carried flowers, others carried folded letters, all carried stories. General Hale stood at the front, uniform immaculate, eyes red-rimmed. He'd insisted on organizing the service himself. "It's the least I can do," he'd told the staff, "and the last thing I owe her." When the honor guard folded the flag and presented it to him, because she had no living family left, his hands shook as he accepted it. He turned to the crowd. The wind cut cold across his face. "She never asked for medals," he began softly. "She never asked for attention. She just asked for decency, for dignity." He paused, letting the silence settle. Sergeant Major Sullivan didn't change the world with speeches or politics. She changed it by showing up, by looking at people others ignored, and reminding us what we'd forgotten. She once told me that soldiers never stop serving, even when the wars end. She proved that true every day of her life. He looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, uniformed and civilian. "So if you want to honor her," he said, voice trembling now, "don't just remember her name. Live what she stood for. Take care of each other. See the invisible. And when you meet someone broken, don't walk past, salute them. Because chances are they've carried more than you'll ever know." The sound of the rifle salute echoed like thunder. 3 sharp cracks that tore through the gray sky. Then silence. When the bugler began taps, Hale closed his eyes. The notes wavered slightly in the wind, fatting over the rows of white headstones, each one a story, a sacrifice, a silence that still spoke. As they lowered her casket, the first snowflakes began to fall. He stayed long after everyone left. Just him, the folded flag, and the quiet. He placed a small token on her grave, the pin she'd kept from the young man she'd helped get sober. "For you, Sergeant Mom," he whispered, "mission complete." In the weeks that followed, the world kept moving, but Margaret's name didn't fade like others. Instead, it grew into something larger than any uniform could contain. The community center was renamed the Margaret Sullivan Veterans Outreach Center. Her photo hung in the entryway, sunlight spilling across her face every morning. General Hale kept working with them, visiting weekly, mentoring volunteers, speaking at schools, but something about him had changed. He carried himself differently now, softer, quieter, like he'd finally found a purpose beyond command. When a journalist asked him once why her story mattered so much, he replied, "Because she didn't just remind us what soldiers can do, she reminded us what humans should do." Months later, at a congressional hearing on veterans reform, her name came up again. A senator held up her photo. "This is why we're here," he said. "Because one woman sat for 4 hours in a waiting room, invisible, and a nation finally saw itself reflected in her silence." That moment made the evening news, but what mattered more were the changes that followed. Funding for veteran outreach tripled. Wait times at hospitals dropped. A new initiative launched nationwide, Project Sullivan, pairing retired veterans with younger ones for mentorship and advocacy. And at the heart of it all was that same message she'd written in her final letter: "Never walk past someone who looks forgotten." Her words became a motto printed on posters, challenge coins, and walls across VA centers. But the truth was, no inscription could capture her exactly. Because her greatest legacy wasn't in programs or policies. It was in people. One evening, nearly a year later, General Hale visited the center again. The sun was setting behind the city skyline, turning the windows gold. Inside, the hall was buzzing with life, laughter, coffee brewing, papers rustling, volunteers working late. He paused at the mural, her silhouette, hand outstretched toward the rising sun. A young Marine, maybe 22, noticed him. "Sir," he said, snapping to attention, "did you know her?" Hale smiled softly. "Yeah, she saved my life." The Marine's eyes widened. "In the war." He looked at the mural again. "In more ways than one." The Marine hesitated. "She must have been something." "She was," Hale said quietly. "But here's the thing, she'd tell you she wasn't special. She'd tell you anyone could have done what she did." The young man nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe, but not everyone would." Hale smiled. "You're right about that." The Marine glanced at the mural again. "We still call her Sergeant Mom around here." Hale's smile deepened. "She'd have liked that." Before he left, he placed his hand gently against the mural, right over the painted heart, and whispered, "You're still here." Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing softly down the hall. That night, as he sat alone in his study, he opened the letter she'd written one more time. The edges were frayed now, the paper soft from being unfolded too many times. He read the last line out loud, voice barely a whisper. "You might be walking past a hero." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the framed flag on the wall, the one from her service. Beneath it, he'd added a small brass plaque that simply read, "We take care of our own." It wasn't just her belief anymore. It was his mission now. Over the next few years, Project Sullivan expanded across the country. Centers opened in cities and small towns alike. Veterans found jobs, homes, and, more importantly, belonging. But the truest tribute came quietly, in the everyday kindnesses that spread between strangers. A young woman helping an old man with his paperwork. A bus driver stopping to greet a homeless vet by name. A nurse making sure no one sat too long in a waiting room without being seen. Small things, invisible to headlines. But each one, in its own way, was Margaret Sullivan still at work. On the 10th anniversary of her passing, a ceremony was held at Arlington. General Hale, older now, his hair silver, stood once more before her grave. He placed a single carnation, her favorite flower, against the headstone. Then with slow, deliberate motion, he saluted. "Still watching over us, aren't you?" he murmured. "You'd probably tell me to stop making a fuss and get back to work." He smiled faintly. "Don't worry, I'm on it." He stood there a moment longer, the wind rustling the nearby flags. Then he turned to leave, whispering, "Rest easy, Sergeant Major. The mission continues." As he walked away, the sunlight broke through the clouds, soft, golden, warm. It spilled across the rows of marble, catching the engraved letters of her name, lighting them like a promise. And for anyone passing by that day, if they looked closely enough, they might have sworn they saw it. A faint shimmer beside her grave, like a salute returned. Because legends don't need monuments. They just need to be remembered. And sometimes, the quietest souls leave the loudest echoes. She'd never met Sergeant Major Margaret Sullivan. But somehow, her name had shaped the course of her life. Private First Class Elena Ramirez had first seen the mural when she was 17, sneaking into the Veterans Outreach Center to use their printer for a college application. She stopped in the hallway, backpack slung over one shoulder, staring at the painted figure on the wall. An older woman in fatigues, hand outstretched toward a rising sun. Beneath it, in careful lettering, read, "She showed us we still matter." Back then, Elena didn't fully understand what that meant. She just remembered the way it made her chest tighten, a mixture of admiration and something else. Something she wouldn't recognize until years later, halfway through her first deployment, when the loneliness began to eat through the edges of her resolve. 10 years had passed since Margaret Sullivan's funeral. Project Sullivan had become part of the military's DNA, mentorships, crisis hotlines, peer networks. Every base had its own outreach wing, every academy its annual lecture about the woman who reminded us to see. To most recruits, the story felt half legend, half lesson, but to Elena it was personal. She'd grown up in foster homes, drifting from place to place, always the new kid, always trying not to need anyone. The Army had been the first place that gave her structure, discipline, purpose. But purpose didn't erase pain, it just hid it better. When she came back from her second tour overseas, the medals felt lighter than the guilt she carried. A convoy ambush, 2 friends gone, one she couldn't save. She smiled through debriefs, saluted through ceremonies, told her mother figure foster sister she was fine. She was. Until one afternoon, she wandered into a Project Sullivan office on base, desperate but pretending she was. The woman at the desk, middle-aged, kind eyes, calm voice, looked up and said, "You're not here by accident, Private. Sit down." That woman was a volunteer named Claire, one of the many veterans Margaret had helped years ago. Elena hesitated. "I don't even know why I came." Claire poured 2 coffees. Neither did Margaret the first time she walked into a waiting room. She just knew she didn't want to feel invisible anymore. That word, invisible, hit home like a round to the chest. Elena sat, and for the first time in months she told someone the truth. They met every week after that. Sometimes they talked about paperwork and benefits. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. Claire would just listen, her presence steady, her silences comforting. One day, Claire handed her a folded photocopy, Margaret's last letter. The same words Hale had once carried in his chest pocket. "Never walk past someone who looks forgotten." Elena read it and something inside her shifted. The words weren't grand. They were simple, but they landed like orders she couldn't ignore. From that day, she stopped drinking alone at night. She stopped avoiding her own reflection. She started volunteering. The first time she helped another soldier, a young man named Tyler struggling to get his PTSD benefits. She realized what Margaret must have felt all those years ago in that waiting room, the quiet power of being useful again. Tyler's claim got approved after months of fighting. When he came back to thank her, his voice cracked mid-sentence. Elena just smiled. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Just promise you'll do the same for someone else." He nodded, and in that moment, Project Sullivan became more than a program. It became a chain of hands, invisible but unbroken, stretching back to a woman she'd never met. A year later, she was assigned to help plan the 10th anniversary ceremony of the program. General Hale was still alive, though older now, walking with a cane. When Elena met him for the first time, she was startled by how human he seemed. No aura of command, just the calm gravity of someone who'd lived long enough to measure his words. "You must be Private Ramirez," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "Claire tells me you're one of the good ones." She laughed awkwardly. "I just file paperwork, sir." He gave her a knowing look. That's what Margaret used to say, too. They sat in his office surrounded by photos, soldiers, ceremonies, and one framed letter on the wall, its ink faded from time. She recognized the handwriting instantly. "You still keep it up?" she asked. He nodded. "Every day. It reminds me why we do this." Then he handed her a small box. Inside was a silver challenge coin engraved with Margaret's motto. "One of these for every volunteer," he said, "but I wanted to give you the first one this year. You earned it." She swallowed hard. "I haven't done anything extraordinary." "Neither did she," he said softly. "She just refused to stop showing up." The ceremony was held at dusk, outside the new National Margaret Sullivan Veterans Memorial. The design was simple, a long granite wall etched with names, not of fallen soldiers, but of those who'd once been lost to neglect and were found again through her work. Above it, in steel letters, her words, "We take care of our own." Thousands attended. Veterans stood beside civilians, teenagers beside retirees. General Hale spoke briefly, his voice raspier now but still steady. "She taught us that leadership has nothing to do with rank," he said. "It's about compassion, about noticing. So if you leave here tonight remembering only one thing, let it be that every time you choose to see someone, you carry on her mission." When he stepped down, he nodded at Elena. "Your turn." Her heart pounded. She wasn't a speaker. But as she walked to the podium, the evening light fell on the mural behind her, Margaret's silhouette reaching toward the sun, and somehow the words came. "I never met Sergeant Major Sullivan," she began, voice trembling, "but she saved me all the same." A ripple moved through the crowd. "I was lost," she continued. "Not on a battlefield, but afterward, when the noise stopped and I didn't know who I was anymore. Project Sullivan gave me a place to stand again. It taught me that strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about helping others when they break." She paused, looking out over the sea of faces. "If she were here tonight, I think she'd tell us not to worship her. She'd tell us to keep doing the small things. The ones no one claps for. The ones that change lives quietly." Her eyes glistened. "So that's what I'll do, and that's what we all should do, keep seeing the unseen." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was soft, steady, like the heartbeat of something alive. General Hale saluted her from the front row. She returned it instinctively. He smiled, eyes bright with pride. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and the floodlights dimmed, Elena lingered by the memorial wall. The marble was cold under her fingers. She traced the engraved letters of Margaret's name. For a moment, she imagined what she might say to her if she could. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't know me, but you found me anyway." The night wind stirred gently, carrying the faint scent of carnations from the flower arrangements. And maybe it was imagination, maybe something else, but she swore she felt warmth on her shoulder, like a reassuring hand. Weeks turned into months. Elena took over coordinating the mentorship program full-time. She began visiting high schools, telling stories not about war, but about empathy. She talked about the woman who'd sat invisible in a waiting room and changed an entire nation's conscience. Students would ask, was she really real? Elena always smiled, as real as the ground you're standing on. One afternoon, a teenage boy stayed behind after a talk. "My mom's a vet," he said quietly. "She doesn't leave the house much. Do you think you could help her?" Elena nodded without hesitation. "Give me her number." That evening she called the woman. They spoke for an hour. By the end of the week she arranged a home visit from a counselor. 2 months later, the woman joined Project Sullivan as a volunteer herself. Each time Elena saw someone step out of the shadows, she thought of Margaret, of the salute, of the waiting room, of the way one small act of recognition had become a bridge across generations. On the first anniversary of the memorial, Elena returned alone. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with rain. She stood in front of the wall, water streaking the granite like tears. She pulled the silver coin from her pocket, the one General Hale had given her, and pressed it gently against Margaret's name. "Still standing," she whispered. Behind her, distant thunder rolled like a low drum. She smiled. "Guess you're still on watch." She turned to leave, the rain picking up, the world washed clean around her. And for the first time in years, she felt light, not because the burden was gone, but because she finally understood why Margaret had carried it for so long. It wasn't duty. It wasn't guilt. It was love. The kind that doesn't fade with uniforms or time. The kind that passes from one soul to another, wordlessly, endlessly. As the camera of history panned out over the memorial, the city, the countless centers bearing her name, the narrator's voice might have said, "Sometimes, immortality isn't carved in stone. It's carried in hearts that keep beating because someone once refused to look away." And somewhere, if you listened closely through the hum of rain and wind, you might have heard it, faint but unmistakable, the echo of a woman's steady voice. "Don't forget them. Don't ever forget." The years kept moving, as they always do. But Margaret Sullivan never really left. Her name faded from headlines, her photo replaced by new faces, new heroes. Yet in corners of the world most cameras never reach, her legacy remained quiet, steady, enduring. At a shelter in Detroit, a retired Marine named Lewis sat across from a young vet, helping him fill out forms. At a base hospital in Texas, a nurse paused before calling the next name and looked up, really looked, before smiling. At a bus stop in San Diego, a teenager handed a blanket to an old man sleeping on the bench without asking questions. None of them spoke her name aloud. Most didn't even know her story. But what she'd started, the simple act of seeing, had become instinct. And that was how she'd won. General Robert Hale passed away 5 years after the 10th anniversary ceremony. He died quietly in his sleep, a folded flag at his bedside and Margaret's letter still framed on the wall. The last entry in his journal read, "We did what we could." She'd say that was enough. At his funeral, the honor guard laid his flag beside hers. 2 headstones, side by side, comrades even in rest. Between them, a small plaque engraved with the words they both had lived by. "We take care of our own." No date, no rank. Just the promise. 20 years after the salute that changed everything, a history teacher named Claire Ramirez, Elena's daughter, stood before a classroom of restless high schoolers. She pulled up a faded photo on the screen, a four-star general saluting an elderly woman in a tattered jacket. "Anyone know who this is?" she asked. A few students squinted, shaking their heads. One boy raised his hand. "That's the lady from those veteran posters, right? Project something." Claire smiled. "Project Sullivan, that's right. Anyone know the story?" No one answered. She turned off the projector and let the silence hang for a moment. "Let me tell you then." And as she spoke, slowly, quietly, like a storyteller passing down something sacred, the room began to still. She told them about a waiting room that smelled of disinfectant, about a woman who'd once dragged a wounded lieutenant through fire, about a salute that reminded a nation what respect really meant. She didn't dramatize it, didn't turn it into myth. She told it like truth, because that's what it was. When she finished, one student in the back whispered, "She sounds like a hero." Claire shook her head gently. She wasn't a hero, she was human. That's what made her matter. After class, one of the students, a quiet girl who usually kept to herself, stayed behind. "My dad's a vet," she said softly. "He doesn't talk about it much. Do you think that project still exists?" Claire smiled. It never stopped. That night, that same girl went home, found a local outreach center online, and signed up to volunteer. And just like that, the echo carried forward again. The world changed, as it always does: new wars, new politics, new distractions. But Project Sullivan outlasted them all. Not because of government funding or media attention, but because it had become something much simpler: culture. Every branch adopted her creed. We take care of our own, not as a slogan, but as a daily practice. It hung in clinics, classrooms, and offices. Soldiers repeated it to one another like a vow. Over time, no one could quite remember where it started. They just knew it mattered. And somewhere in that forgetting was the beauty of it, that her message no longer needed her name to survive. One autumn morning, decades later, a small group of cadets from West Point visited Arlington on a leadership tour. Their instructor paused before a pair of graves, two simple headstones side by side. The names half-worn by time, the letters soft from years of rain. One of the cadets, a young woman named Abigail Kim, knelt to read the inscription between them. "We take care of our own," she read aloud. "Who were they?" The instructor smiled faintly. "That's a long story." "Tell it," another cadet said. So he did, right there among the rows of marble, with the wind rustling the flags above them. He told them about the woman in the waiting room, about the general who remembered her, about the salute that became a mirror held up to an entire country. By the end, the cadets stood in silence. One reached out and brushed the dust off her name. Another whispered, "She'd have hated the attention." The instructor chuckled. "That's what makes her unforgettable." Before they left, Abigail slipped a small token between the two graves, her cadet insignia. "For you both," she said softly, "for teaching us what leadership really means." And as they walked away, the wind carried the faint scent of carnations through the air. That evening, a janitor making his rounds at the cemetery found the insignia glinting faintly in the moonlight. He paused, looked at the names, and smiled without knowing why. He saluted. Then he whispered, still standing, before continuing on his way. Some stories fade. Others settle quietly into the bones of the world, becoming part of its heartbeat. Margaret Sullivan's story became one of those. Not a monument, not a chapter in a textbook. Something smaller, gentler, a whisper shared between people who chose kindness when no one was watching. 50 years after that waiting room moment, the VA opened a new national facility, modern, clean, built from glass and light. At its entrance stood a bronze statue, not of a soldier in combat, not of a general. It was Margaret. Not young, not idealized. Just as she was that day, sitting on a chair, jacket too big, eyes distant but unbroken. Beside her, etched into the base, her own words. Heroes don't always look the way you expect. Sometimes they're just people waiting to be seen. Visitors would pass by, sometimes stopping to read, sometimes not. Children would climb the base, veterans would nod silently, nurses would touch the bronze hand for luck before a long shift. No speeches, no pomp, just presence. And somehow that was perfect. Because she had never needed an audience, only understanding. On the anniversary of her birth, the memorial hall hosted a small ceremony, modest, as she'd have wanted. Elena Ramirez, now gray-haired but still sharp-eyed, gave the final address. She stood before the statue, voice trembling slightly. "I've been asked 1,000 times what Margaret Sullivan would say if she were here today," she began. "But I think we already know." She gestured toward the crowd, veterans, families, young recruits. "She tell us to keep showing up, to look out for each other, to keep the promise." Elena paused, glancing at the bronze figure beside her. "She tell us not to make saints out of soldiers, to remember that compassion is courage too." Then she smiled, and she'd probably scold me for talking too long. Laughter rippled softly through the room. Elena's gaze lingered on the statue one last time. "We don't get to choose how we're remembered," she said. "We only choose how we live, and she lived for others. That's what made her unforgettable." She stepped back. The crowd rose in quiet applause. Somewhere in the back, a young cadet wiped her eyes. Somewhere near the door, an old veteran saluted and whispered, "Thank you, Sergeant Major." The light from the skylight shifted just then, falling across the statue's face in such a way that for a fleeting second, it almost looked alive. A glint of bronze caught the corner of her sculpted eye, like a tear. And if you stood there long enough, you might have sworn the faint echo of a voice moved through the stillness, calm, steady, proud. "We take care of our own." Outside, the world kept turning. Cars passed, birds scattered from the trees. Life continued, messy, beautiful, loud. But somewhere in that noise, invisible and eternal, lived the rhythm she'd left behind. Every time someone stopped to help a stranger. Every time a nurse chose patience over frustration. Every time a soldier paused to salute someone overlooked. That was her voice speaking through them. Not in words, but in action. The kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The kind that endures when the rest fades. Because in the end, that was her lesson, simple, profound, and everlasting. That dignity doesn't demand attention. That true strength is gentle. That every unseen act of kindness is a salute to someone who once refused to give up. And maybe, just maybe, she's still watching. Not from above, but from within the moments we choose compassion over convenience, humanity over indifference. The moments that prove she was right all along. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in doing so, it never dies.